This is the third in a series of podcasts on the subject of punctuation. They accompany the Journalism 181 Punctuation Cheat Sheet. Part 3, the comma. Commas have a number of different functions. They separate items in a series. They separate adjectives in a series. Now, I know adjectives are items, so B could properly be subsumed under A. But adjectives behave a little bit differently, and we will talk about them separately. They separate introductory and parenthetical material from the rest of the sentence. They mark non-essential, also called non-restrictive, relative clauses. And they separate many appositives from the nouns to which they refer. Now, there are a great many other things commas do, of course, such as, for example, join sentences when they are followed by a coordinating conjunction like and or. For the details on that, please see the podcast on sentence combining. Let's start with the fact that commas separate items in a series. For example, the first example is from Jonathan Swift and was mentioned in the first of the punctuation podcasts. A most delicious, nourishing and wholesome food. Now, this is not, in fact, the way Swift wrote it. He did not have a comma there. He had a comma, as you may recall, at the point where he might logically pause, in a place where we would not, in fact, put a comma. But here we have a series of adjectives, delicious, nourishing, and wholesome. We have a comma between the two that are right next to each other. Likewise, for of the Three Stooges, Moe, Curly, Larry, and Shemp. Again, commas between each pair of names that are directly next to each other. You'll notice that in neither case is there a comma before the and that's one way of doing it. We could put a comma before the and that would be perfectly fine. That comma, by the way, the one that occurs right before the conjunction, is called the serial comma. And there's actually some discussion among style books about the serial comma. Should it be included? Should it not be included? It's worth taking a minute and talking about it. The serial comma is defined as the comma that precedes the conjunction. So if we have Moe, Curly, Larry, serial comma, that's that particular comma, and Shemp. Now, style books differ as to whether they think it's a good idea to have the serial comma. Everybody pretty much agrees that if the list is short, you want to leave it out. Nobody really wants to put a comma after the white in red, white, and blue. The Associated Press style book says leave out the serial comma unless you have a really good reason for including it. For example, it's needed for clarity. Alternatively, a good reason for including it might be to not have your readers laugh at you. For example, here's a sentence from a description of a documentary about the life of country singer Merle Haggard. Among those interviewed were his two ex-wives, Kris Kristofferson and Robert Duvall. Now, I think a serial comma would have been a really good idea in that sentence. It's worth paying attention to the use of commas in a series of adjectives. For example, in the series a hot, muggy, rainy afternoon, we have commas between all the adjectives, but not, of course, after the last adjective, which is the one that comes immediately before the noun. However, there are cases where you don't put commas between the adjectives. For example, a clever little paragraph, a great big truck, my big fat Greek grammar lesson. What's the difference? Well, the little in clever little paragraph doesn't usually mean small. It's not being used literally. And the same is true of great in great big truck. It's part of the adjective phrase great big, and it really just intensifies the notion of bigness. And, well, the same thing with big fat Greek grammar lesson or big fat anything. It says important, significant, so not intended to be literal. Of course, you can spend a lot of time worrying about whether an adjective is used literally or not, but actually there's a very simple test. Can you insert and between the adjectives? If so, use commas. A hot and muggy and rainy afternoon. Perfectly fine. A clever and little paragraph. No. A great and big truck? No. My big and fat and Greek grammar lesson? Really no. So this is a very convenient test. If you can insert and between the adjectives, then you can use commas. Commas separate introductory and parenthetical material from the rest of the sentence. So sentences might begin, for example, with a subordinate clause. When all is said and done, comma. While there is some doubt among experts, comma. With a prepositional phrase, after that debacle, comma. With an interjection, yes, comma. With a conjunct, however, comma, moreover, comma, or therefore, comma. Similarly, commas separate parenthetical material from the rest of the sentence, material that basically interrupts the basic structure of the sentence. So they insisted upon increased security. If you want to put after that debacle in the middle of that, you set it off with commas. They insisted, comma, after that debacle, upon increased security. It was that decision that made agreement impossible is the basic sentence. If you want to add the words of course, it was that decision, comma, of course, comma, that made agreement impossible. And similarly, it was that decision, comma, necessary though it was, comma, that made agreement impossible. In each case, the material kind of interrupts the flow of the basic sentence. Very similarly, commas mark non-essential, that is, non-restrictive relative clauses. Now, there's another podcast with information about essential and non-essential relative clauses, and it gives an introduction to the concepts as well as their definitions and lots of examples. For right now, though, we're just going to zip through this material, treating it as a quick review. So, an essential relative clause is one that is needed in order to identify who or what you're talking about, the thing or person that the noun phrase, the NP, refers to. It's referent, and that's what that means. The non-essential relative clause provides extra information. You already know the person or thing that you're talking about, the referent of the noun phrase. Non-essential relative clauses are set off with commas because they're not essential. They interrupt the sentence to give some additional information. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Here's a case of an essential relative clause. The senator who had supported the bill said later that he believed it was not strong enough. Now, in this case, who had supported the bill is necessary to identify which senator we're talking about. We're talking about the senator who had supported the bill. The way we know that's an essential relative clause is that it has no commas. Very often in writing, the presence or absence of commas is going to be the only thing that tells you whether a clause is essential or non-essential. The non-essential relative clause would be set off by commas, and that would occur if we already knew who the senator was, if instead of the senator we had a name like Jones, right? Jones, comma, who had supported the bill, comma, said later he believed it was not strong enough. Let's say that we know who Jones is, and Jones is that senator. We say the senator, the one we already know about, comma, who had supported the bill, comma, said later he believed it was not strong enough. Here's an example of a context in which you might have a non-essential relative clause. Senator Jones was asked several questions about this controversial legislation. Okay, we now know we're talking about Senator Jones. The senator, meaning Senator Jones, comma, who had supported the bill, comma, said later he believed it was not strong enough. This is quite important. As I said, very often the only way you can tell the difference between an essential and a non-essential relative clause is the presence or absence of commas. And as we noted in the first of the punctuation podcasts, if you get that wrong, you can end up saying something you didn't mean to say. Finally, commas separate many appositives from the nouns to which they refer. Now, there are different types of apposition. I'm talking here about nouns and noun phrases just because it's the most common, but this would apply as well to other types of apposition. Apposition means quite simply that a structure is placed next to another similar structure and modifies it. We'll use examples with noun phrases. That is, in the case of noun phrases, a noun phrase appositive is a noun phrase that modifies another noun phrase just by virtue of being placed after it. It's not otherwise grammatically connected to it. It's just put in place right after it. For example, Roberts, comma, the new Chief Justice. Notice that if the sentence continued, we would see it as Roberts and then the rest of the sentence, but that the new Chief Justice is an appositive, and like some of the other examples, it kind of interrupts the sentence, just to clarify who we're talking about. Roberts, comma, the new Chief Justice. However, if your appositive is short and or it's needed to identify which entity you're referring to, you generally don't use commas. So this is a little bit like the essential and non-essential relative clauses. The Greek god Zeus. There are a lot of Greek gods. Zeus being a very short name, right? The Greek god Zeus, you don't put a comma there. That identifies which Greek god. His daughter Mary. Mary would identify which daughter. So no commas. However, if the initial phrase identifies clearly who you're talking about, even if the appositive is short, you go ahead and use a comma. The Greek god of thunder, comma, Zeus. Now, in fact, there's only one Greek god of thunder, so his only daughter Mary, his only daughter, comma, Mary. Because once you say his only daughter, you've uniquely identified the person that you're talking about. Now, unfortunately, things are never as simple or as consistent as we would like them to be. And indeed, if the appositive, the second of those noun phrases, is longer, you go ahead and use a comma, even if it is essential to identify which of the entities you're referring to. The Greek god, comma, Zeus the Thunderer. His daughter, comma, Congresswoman Mary Belmont. Okay, on to errors. There are a number of errors that are extremely common in the use of the comma, and it's important to watch out for them. One of them is forgetting to check for paired commas. As we noted, commas are used to set apart material that interrupts the basic structure of the sentence. It's very easy to put that first comma in place and forget to check and make sure that the material is surrounded by commas, that there is a kind of closing comma after it when you return to the basic structure of the sentence. So always check for paired commas. Number 2, using commas for essential relative clauses. As we saw in the first of the punctuation podcasts, getting that wrong can end up providing incorrect information. Finally, comma splices. Now, we didn't talk about them in this particular podcast, but they are a major punctuational sin. To find out more about comma splices, please see the podcast on sentence combining. And of course, for more information on essential and non-essential relative clauses, see the podcast on relative clauses. And that is the end of part 3.